All right, we got 1 hour. We got 1 hour to cover U.S.-China, a small subject, and we've got an all-star panel, so we're going to do our best to breeze through this and give you the best information we can. If I introduce everybody, it'll take the whole hour, the resumes with these people. You have resumes, you've got their background in your kits, but I'm going to start out just by asking each one a question, and I'll give you a little capsule who they are. Graham Allison, the founding dean of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School. Do you need to know anything more about this guy? The books he's written. You were in the Reagan administration, advisor, Secretary of Defense, Clinton administration.
Lots to be blamed for it.
Yeah, we won't blame you for it. Okay, Graham, let's start out. Your new book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides? I'm from Minnesota, I can't say it. Say it for me? Thucydides. Yeah, John was training me earlier and I completely blanked. All right.
It's fourth tone.
It's fourth tone. There we go. Are we destined for war at the beginning of your title?
Okay, so thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially with such an amazing panel, and we won't get through everything, but let me say, are the U.S. and China destined for war, or as the subtitle of the book says, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? And I apologize for being professorial, but I think the answer is no and yes, okay? So let me explain, okay? And I'll answer the question with respect to can we escape Thucydides' trap. But before I do that, let me just take 1 second, because everybody here should meet a big thinker today and should know how to pronounce his name. So on 3, we're going to do it in unison. 1, 2, 3. Thucydides. One more time. Thucydides. One more time. Thucydides. If you want a fun exercise, go to the Thucydides Trap website and you can see various people, including Xi Jinping, mashing this word, okay? Many Americans have trouble with it. Okay, so Thucydides' trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. That's what happened as Athens rose to challenge Sparta in classical Greece. That's what happened as Germany rose to challenge Britain in the decades just before World War I. And that's what's happening in the relationship between China and the U.S. today. That's the fundamental dynamic, I believe. So, no, the U.S. and China cannot escape Thucydides' trap if we insist on business as usual. So in the book, I argue business as usual, which is what I think we've seen for the last 25 years, Republican and Democratic administrations alike, is likely to produce history as usual. And as I show in the book, history as usual turns out to be war, even catastrophic war. So I look at 16 cases. I find 16 cases in the last 500 years when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, 12 of them in war, 4 of them in not war. So yes, we can escape Thucydides' trap, I say, as Santayana taught us. Only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So there's no obligation for us to make the same mistakes that people made in Athens and Sparta, or that people made in Britain and Germany before World War I. And there are a lot of lessons for us to learn from the success stories, including the rise of the U.S. and Britain's agile accommodation at the beginning of the 20th century when the U.S. became the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, or the Cold War, which is called war, but in my column it counts as no war because there was not thousands of people killing each other with bombs and bullets. So the objective of the book is to help us see that we're in a condition in which a rising power is threatening to displace a ruling power. That's what has been happening. That's what will be happening. That's the subtext of everything. And therefore, it's extremely dangerous. And the book is not meant to be fatalistic or pessimistic. It's about how we can, by learning from the lessons of failure, as well as from success, escape Thucydides' trap and therefore not see war.
Well, that perfect segue to Patricia Kim. She's a Stanton Fellow, Council on Foreign Relations, PhD from Princeton, and you're studying now the pattern of U.S.-China and the behavior between the two countries and how they deal with each other, how they shape each other's behavior. Do you have any ideas on how we avoid a clash?
So let me first start by saying that I completely agree with Graham that there are certainly risks, especially when there are two egos in a room that believe that they are special or exceptional. Having said that, though, I don't think China and the United States are destined to clash. And one thing I would point out is that most leaders in the US, in general, are not opposed to China's strength or its success per se. You know, many American leaders have said, and I don't think they've lied, I think they were genuine when they say that a strong and prosperous China doesn't go against American interests, and China can be an asset to the world and do productive things with its power, like it's doing now by building infrastructure in underdeveloped areas. And on the other hand, I don't think Chinese leaders necessarily want the United States to disappear from the Asian region as well, even though there are certainly elements of the United States' presence that they feel uncomfortable with. And I think there's a level of understanding among Chinese leaders of the important role that America plays in providing security to the region and playing a restraining role, so restraining the military ambitions of other key players in the region like South Korea or Japan, who, if they were independent, would probably seek greater military capabilities, maybe even nuclear weapons, and this wouldn't be good for China's strategic interests. So I think there, and maybe, Wu Laoshi could tell me if this is right or wrong, but I think there is a recognition among Chinese leaders that, that America does have a role to play in Asia. Having said that, I think it's inevitable that there will be disagreements and these need to be managed. And I think just being realistic and knowing that it's going to happen is important. And I think one way to avoid clashes is by understanding each other's red lines. So I think for China, this would be things like, challenging its theoretical sovereignty over Taiwan. Or for the United States, it would be challenging its freedom of navigation in the region. And I'm not advocating, I want to be clear, I'm not advocating that we simply accept all of China's demands or we acquiesce or accommodate China in every area. But what I'm saying is that it's probably better to use our diplomatic energy in a smarter and more efficient way by, if we don't need to, we shouldn't directly challenge China on what it would consider its core interests if we don't need to go there. And because the automatic response from Beijing would be to, snap back. And I think it's better first to try to persuade Chinese leaders on why doing, X, Y, or Z is good for their interests. So taking a persuasive approach to diplomacy is a good first step. And obviously, this kind of diplomacy is not easy. It requires trust between the two sides. There's always going to be a level of skepticism of intentions and, are they telling the truth? But, I think it could be dealt with by forging good relations, meeting regularly, and having talented diplomats.
Professor Wu Xinbo is one of the most articulate academics in China on international affairs, U.S.-China relations. He heads up he's executive dean of the Institute of International Studies at Fudan and the Center for American Studies at Fudan. He's written endless number of books and articles, and I've appeared on a few panels with him, and I always enjoy it because I learn from you. And today you are representing the Chinese viewpoint. You are China, buddy. So, yeah. So what's the Chinese view of this tea trap? Low tea or whatever they call it on TV.
Well, I think originally we were quite upset with his campaign rhetoric, obviously. And then after Trump was elected, he began to talk about he wouldn't necessarily abide by one China policy if China does not cooperate on trade issues. That really made the Chinese leaders upset. However, after his meeting with President Xi in Mar-a-Lago in late April, and both President Trump and President Xi agreed on the roadmap of U.S.-China relations over the next 1 year or two. I think our side began to feel relaxed and thinking that Trump has learned very quickly and become more pragmatic in dealing with China. And this lasted for a while until very recently when we had the economic dialogue. and in which I think China put on the table some very constructive proposals, which were sanctioned, supported by the US counterparts, while President Trump was not necessarily supporting that and wanted to have more aggressive agenda in trade relations with China. This, again, made the Chinese side worried that if that is whether he really has a big picture of this relationship or he just will focus on one specific issue and insist on approach which, from our opinion, is not necessarily the right approach. For example, if you look at the trade imbalance, you have to think about this in the context of globalization, division of labor, value chain, all these kind of things. So you don't just look at the statistics, which in many cases is misleading. So I think on our side, the good news is that it seems he is not delivering what he promised to do during the campaign. And he learned very quickly, and he wanted to have a good personal relationship with President Xi. But on the other hand, President Trump doesn't seem to have a big picture of this relationship, and not necessarily know what's the end goal of this relationship, and also not necessarily taking advice from some of his smart advisors who know more about this relationship, especially on the economic front. So it's a mixed picture.
All right, thank you. John Pomfret, an old friend of mine, was one of the early American students in China, Nanda, if I remember right, at Nanjing Dashi.
Nanjing University, yeah.
And a legendary foreign correspondent for the Associated Press and the Washington Post in China. He has just finished a book about, well, it came out last November, is that right? A book that I just can't stop recommending on U.S.-China. He spent 7 years on it, it nearly killed him. You can buy it right out there, A Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, or Middle Kingdom, A Beautiful Country. I forget which order they go in, John.
Age Before Beauty, actually, well.
Okay, there we go. John, you know, we always get advice that the way to get along with China is to persuade, that's a word you use, and be nice, and behind closed doors, make your arguments. Does that work?
So Americans have been dealing with China since 1783. We just didn't start our relationship with Richard Nixon. And we've been dealing in Asia since 1783. And generally speaking, if you try to look at the course of U.S. engagement with Asia, not with Greece, but with Asia, the thing that has worked, generally speaking, has been a very firm, consistent pursuit of U.S. interests and less concern with the niceties of diplomacy. And generally speaking, when we concede too much to any Asian power, whether it been Tsarist Russia, the British, or the Japanese, and now China, you get into problems. And I think that at the current point in the United States right now, we have the confluence of something that makes me actually quite concerned. One is, increasingly there's a conclusion in Washington, but in business circles as well, that the relationship between the United States and China is skewed. This is from the American perspective. And that there's been a very unreciprocal relationship with China, both in, for example, the media space, but also in the financial and business space as well, whereas Chinese firms can have a lot more freedom in America, whereas American firms, for example, have a lot less freedom in China. So on one hand, you have this sense in the United States, I can't speak on China's behalf, but that the relationship is skewed and needs to be righted. At the same time, you have, as Professor Wu said, clearly an American president who lacks strategic vision for how to right this very, very unreciprocal relationship. And that combination worries me far more than the Thucydides trap or anything like that, because if you look at the past history in the United States, for example, in the 1920s and the 1930s, we faced a rising power in Asia, Japan, with policies that did not right the very unreciprocal relationship. And I think that looking at that much more as a model, because it's in Asia, and I think in some ways more relevant, leads one to worry that if this relationship is not righted, which would involve pushing back on a lot of Chinese issues. Core interests is something that Patricia mentioned, and I totally agree. The problem with Chinese core interests, they need to be respected, but they begin to metastasize, right? First it's Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen, then it's the South China Sea, and then what's next? And so those issues, yes, we have to respect China. The question is, how far? And that game, and that would demand a president with strategic vision, and I don't think we have one right now. So I think
I want
those
a quick
combinations
question
are
to
difficult.
Patricia. So we always talk about China core interests. What are America core interests?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder to say in a democracy like America where you have a new administration and every couple years there's a new national security strategy memorandum. But I would say, you know, obviously security, democracy at home, promoting universal values abroad, although how much we do this depends on different administrations and at different times. Graham, would you like to jump in? What are some of our other core interests?
Well,
Especially in Asia with China, in vis-a-vis China.
I don't want to be too academic about it, but there was a commission on American national interest that I was part of that produced a report in 2000. You could go find it if you're interested on the Belfer webpage. And basically, the core vital interest for the U.S. is, as was in the Cold War, is, quote, the survival of the U.S. as a free nation with our fundamental institutions and values intact. So that's kind of the base. And then you get from vital to extremely important to important and others. Distinguishing between our vital interests, that is what things that really matter to our survival and well-being, and other interests is very hard to do because Americans are interested in everything, and diplomacy requires that you say to whichever country arrives, you're the most important country in the world, we care most about you, blah, blah, blah. But I think if you look at the situation, especially in the Asian context, as China rises to be bigger and stronger, we're going to have to learn to distinguish between what's vital for us on the one hand and what's simply vested. That is the way we did it for a long time. So, for example, how much interest is it to the U.S.? Who owns which island in the South China Sea? It's very important for the U.S. Freedom of navigation, but who's even more interested in freedom of navigation than the U.S.? China. So this is not an issue. I mean, I think that's a red herring that we raise over and over and over. They're not interested in interfering with freedom of navigation, and it would be easy enough, I think, to write a rule that everybody would agree to. So I think that the fact that the U.S. established an Asian economic and security order in the period after World War II, that's been the Pax Americana in Asia, which has provided an environment that has enabled all of the Asian miracles, for none more successfully than China. That order is now being challenged by China and will be challenged by China because as it looks and asks, why is the U.S. Navy the arbiter of events in the South China Sea? We think that's normal. That's ever since Midway. It's been fantastic for the whole region, including for Chinese. But when we try to explain that to our colleagues, they say, well, maybe that was then, but now it's slightly different. And if you want to try to get it from an American perspective, I have a chapter in the book on what if Xi's China were just like us, in which I compare us when we were emerging to what Teddy Roosevelt was sure was going to be an American century, beginning of the century. And if you look, he looks out from Washington and says, what the hell are Spanish doing in Cuba? I mean, why should they be in Cuba? And what are British and German warships doing settling territorial disputes in Venezuela? And why is it that other people have opinions about whether we should have a canal in Colombia? And so we sponsor a coup, we create a new country, gives us a contract for our canal. We take advantage of the explosion of the Maine in Havana, declare war in Spain, liberate Cuba, take Puerto Rico, get Guam. So I would say that the natural, in the Thucydidean terms, the natural expression of a rising power that's confident about its future is that things on my border, things in my adjacencies, look like they're mine. look like I should be the predominant power in that region. And I think we need to ask ourselves then, which of those things are vital for us and which are only the way we've been doing things for a long time.
Yeah, John, I know you're itching to answer, and I want you to, but I want to add a little bit too. One thing that was interesting for me in your book was that the Transcontinental Railroad and the Panama Canal were sold by business interests as being necessary for trading with China and Asia.
Right. Actually, even the borders of Missouri were set by the senator, basically a little bit farther east over into the Missouri River Valley, because he believed that if he made his state just that much closer to China, the state would get great benefits as well. So.
Great story.
You know, in Graham's book, he talks about, that we now have the most disciplined Chinese leader we've seen, well, probably, I don't know, since some emperor. And now we've got the most undisciplined American leader since America was founded. So does Trump scare China? I mean, look, he was saying 45% tariffs. Chinese climate change is basically a hoax from the Chinese. And then he has this chocolate cake summit in Mar-a-Lago and comes back and says that Xi Jinping's my best friend. And then, I don't know where he is now. I haven't looked at the news today on what he's saying. And that must scare the hell out of China.
Well, he did scare China during the campaign, and also after he was elected, his comment on the Taiwan issue. But after that, he has not scared China that much. The problem for our side is that because Trump is so good at bargaining, making a deal. So sometimes you don't know, some of his stance, rhetoric, which is the bargaining tactic, which is really the bottom line of his policy. So that means there is a credibility problem in dealing with him, because when he says something, you may say, "Oh, that's bluffing." He doesn't really mean it. He just want to, get 1 inch ahead. But at some time, you think maybe he's serious about this. So I think it takes some time for us. I think for other outside observers, maybe even the audience in the U.S., to really read his mind. What's his real intention? And also, it's quite interesting in terms of the style of dealing with President Xi. I guess when they met in Mar-a-Lago, they did have a good meeting. When President Xi left, I guess President Xi told him, "Let's stay in touch. If you have any problem, let's talk on the phone." So in less than 1 week after President Xi returned to China, he called President Xi. And then the second week, he called President Xi again. So I think he was about to call President Xi the third time in the third week. But President Xi is very busy. So mostly you cannot, the top leaders, they cannot have, they cannot talk about the details. They have their team, they have their assistants to deal with this issue. So this is also a difference in the style, and we have to, learn how to deal with him.
Let me ask, I want to ask anybody and everybody on the panel about U.S. politics. I mean, are we capable, in your book you talk about the U.S. needs not a new China strategy, but the U.S. needs to pause for reflection. I mean, U.S. politics today, are we able to pause for reflection and really kind of, because the business community, the foreign business, American business community in China, and when we're in Washington, we're pushing for reciprocity. Yeah, we're pushing for saying, okay, now China's grown up to be a very powerful economy. There's a lot of issues. Let's start over again being equal. Are we able to do some kind of a reset, or is this just going to kind of be a clown show for a while?
Well, I'll do a little piece of it, but I'd be interested in the other views. I think in the conclusion, this book is mainly about the diagnosis of the fact that we find ourselves in this dangerous dynamic called Thucydides trap. And that's not a problem to be fixed. I think it's a condition to be endured for a generation. and it's going to require a lot of challenge. But in the conclusion, I say, then, therefore, so what? And the so what, I don't have an easy fix, because I don't think it's easily fixable. But I have a kind of a wild idea, okay? And the wild idea is if you imagine that there were adult supervision in international affairs, which of course we know there's not. There's just a jungle, and the leaders are the leaders, and there's nobody above them that can offer any advice. But in my class, I sometimes imagine there's a Martian strategist who's watching all this. And occasionally I call her and ask her to come down and give us some pointers, you know, what's going on. And I think if she had come down to the Mar-a-Lago summit with Xi and Trump, she would have said, I have a little advice for you. Each of you have at least 17 insurmountable problems. Secondly, all those are inside your own border. And the first one on that list for you, Trump, is whether the American government, the American society can govern itself. Because you have a dysfunctional democracy, for sure, and it doesn't seem to be getting better. And I think she would say the same thing to Xi Jinping. You're trying to rehabilitate a retro authoritarian system with citizens who have smartphones and who can see the world and can see a lot of information. And as Lee Kuan Yew said to Xi Jinping, that's an operating system that won't operate, you know, in this new environment. So I think each have huge, and I think that's why if we could imagine this Martian telling the two of them, you guys could think of something as smart as maybe Pericles did, the 30-year peace. Why don't you find a way to shelve some of the problems? Because you got enough problems at home to deal with.
Yeah, this is the only administration where you think having Martian intervention might really help.
Well, I mean, to tell the truth, Ronald Reagan invented this mythical Martian. At one stage, in a meeting with Gorbachev, this is God's truth, he said to Gorbachev, you know, look, if we were invaded by Martians, you and I would be allies, you know, fighting them. And the guy who was doing the translation couldn't quite tell whether Reagan thought that this was happening or whether he was inventing so it took a little bit of time, and Gorbachev was trying to think, what? But once he got the idea, this is not a bad idea.
You know, John, you know, the thing about, we talk about all the divisions between China and the U.S. and, you know, the political DNA of the two systems is so different. But if you really look at the facts on the ground, our kids get along. There's 350,000 Chinese students in America. There's boatloads of young Americans in China. You know, the people married across borders. Our businesses generally get along pretty well. Sometimes when it gets political with state-owned enterprise, it gets more difficult. And so there is a very strong base. But we've got both sides, both political systems are now using the other one as a whipping boy. And we have been doing that for a while. I mean, is there a way to turn that back?
Well, it's interesting because even on that level, though, I think there's some issues. So we do have 300,000+ Chinese students in universities in the United States, but that's even become problematic. There is a significant amount of fraud in the Chinese system of people applying into American colleges. American colleges, specifically state schools, an example would be the University of Minnesota, where 10% of the student body is from China. These kids are coming and they're paying full freight now, full tuition, and they're effectively subsidizing, you know, young men and women from Minnesota who can go to school there. And the problem, even in this area, which should be a great success story between our two countries, is that these young men and women from China are not really capable of accepting U.S. education. They're accepted without really seriously looking at their applications. Because of the fraud, many of them don't speak English. And they stay amongst themselves when they come to university. When they come to the United States, they open their WeChat app and they can find people to take their tests for them and write their papers for them. So even this success story is increasingly fraught with problems between the two sides. generally speaking, from 3,000 to 30,000 feet, I agree with you that there are a lot of huge, important ties between both our countries, both in education, science and technology, academia, et cetera. But even in those positive stories, you now have like real rustling of problems as well. So I worry that even in the sort of the feel-good stories now, you have a lot of difficulties between the two sides.
I'd welcome Xinbo or Patricia. Both of you are academics. You can represent academia right now.
Well, certainly there is asymmetric situation in the education exchange between the two sides. Now we have, every year we have about over 20,000 American students come to study in China, over 20,000.
Sorry, 20,000 Americans?
Yeah, 20,000.
In Fudan?
No, in China, China universities, as compared with 300,000, around 300,000 Chinese students come to study in the U.S. So this is a asymmetric situation. I think part of the problem has to do with one, it's difficult for American students to take classes in Chinese at Chinese universities. And secondly, I think there is also a financial issue for them, even though during the Obama administration, the Chinese government agreed to provide 10,000 full scholarship to American students applying to study in China. So, so far I have personally advised over a dozen American students at Fudan University for master and PhD program, and most of them have performed quite well. That is because we have very strict criteria in recruiting them. Fudan University is a state university. We don't have to worry about financial issues. We don't rely on the tuition for the operation of the university because we have the budget from the state. While John just mentioned some of the U.S. universities, I guess some private in particular, they may just look at this as purely a business. So they have a very loosened criteria and procedure in reviewing the applicants from not just from China, but also from other countries as well. Yeah. So education exchange basically is a good thing, but I think there needs to be more quality control in this process.
All right, I'm going to turn it to the audience, but I want to let Patricia and Graham make any comments that they have on what's been said, if there's anything you want to add. On anything, any topic we've discussed, or if there's something else, I want to just give you a chance.
I would just add, I was a student at Fudan at one of the programs that Wu Laoshi created, and that was just, it was a critical time in my life. It was 6 months where I got to spend in China and really understand, what China's about, what the people are concerned about, what their history is. So, for me, it was a very valuable experience. And it seems like there are issues, or just getting enough American students to China. And I think one way China has tried to mitigate that is through these Confucian institutes, establishing those in the U.S. The problem has been, I think there's sort of a cultural disconnect where the Confucian institutes, there are a lot of restrictions, and they're not, willing to talk about certain subjects that Chinese officials deem sensitive, to talk about those openly. So I know at Princeton, where I went to school, there was, I think they wanted to establish one there, and we ended up not having one, and one of it had to do with academic freedom. So I think there's this disconnect in culture of what's good, what's appropriate, and that's another wall that's going to need to cross.
Yeah, I want to ask Graham about the Kennedy School. Tony Sach and now with Edward Cunningham have had a program for quite a few years of, originally it was Chinese officials coming in, including some people that are fairly high up right now, coming in for leadership training. Tell me about that process, what you've learned, what you think they've learned. Has that help glue together the countries, or?
Well, I think both I'll talk to that specifically, but put it in the general context. I think you can find many factors that to be bases for cooperation between the U.S. and China. So positive signs, and you can also find the negative signs, and I think we're hearing a little bit of both of those. I mean, how in the world could the leader of China, who's going to be the leader for as far as the eye can see, have only one daughter, his princess, and send her to college at Harvard? I mean, it seems crazy. I think, she's not there looking for targets for missiles or something. So this would be a very unusual thing to do if you're sure this is your arch enemy. Yeah. It's a pretty. Tony Sage at the Asia Center, or the Ash Center that does Asian studies at Harvard, has run a series of executive programs in which we have people from, the deputy mayors of a lot of cities come, and they learn what lessons have been learned in other instances here, and we learn from them. I was at a conference there in the end of June, beginning of July, where they were exchanging lessons. So I think there are a lot of straws that go in one direction.
You would think that creates a lot of understanding and goodwill.
Yeah, and in fact, some personal relationships in which you can have quite candid conversations. Like, I've gotten to know Xinbo over time, but I probably have 50 Chinese that I can, friends that I could sit down and talk to very candidly. I was, for example, when I was in Beijing, beginning of July, I'm sitting down with a fellow who's part of the security services there, and he said, Graham, I really think this thing about you all pivoting to Asia and all that, you need to double down in Afghanistan, because that's the most important problem. And I said, you son of a bitch, you want us to be bogged down? He says, well, of course, why not?
All right, let's turn to the audience here. All right, in the middle there, Ira.
Thank you. My name is Ira Kassoff. I'd like to ask the panelists to look forward a bit, let's say 6 months forward, in terms of where you think U.S.-China relations will be. As various people have said, President Trump has been all over the place, from threatening tariffs on China to declaring China a currency manipulator and so forth, and then swinging the other way when he thought President Xi was going to solve North Korea for us, and they became best friends. I think if solving North Korea means getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, that's not going to happen. So let's take that as the premise, that China is not going to solve North Korea for us. So what does that mean for U.S.-China relations once the U.S. administration figures that out?
Perfect question, because this young lady's focusing on that. You're going to solve the North Korea problem.
No, I'm not.
Almost done.
So, I mean, I would agree with you, and I think the panels yesterday concluded that we're not going to get North Korea denuclearized anytime soon. But having said that, I think, rolling back the program or freezing it in the short term and maybe denuclearization in the long term is not necessarily impossible. And in order to do that, China is going to have to be a key player in any sort of initiative. And I think the current administration has taken the wrong approach with Beijing on this. So Trump came in trying to take a transactional approach. Maybe he was drawing from his real estate days, saying, hey, we'll give you a good trade deal if you help us on North Korea. And I think that was the wrong policy, because it set this impression that somehow China was doing us a favor by cracking down on North Korea. And that's the wrong idea, because we should be saying, hey, you're helping yourself by helping us or doing something about North Korea. So I can't predict. I don't think anyone can predict where we're going to go in 6 months with this administration. But what I hope they can do, and I hope Xi can become, or not Xi. I hope Trump can maybe go to Xi and sort of take on a statesman-like approach. We were just talking about Lee Kuan Yew and Kissinger and how they were such great strategists. And maybe he could go to Xi instead and say, hey, look, the Japanese, the South Koreans are coming to me on a daily basis and saying, can you lift so South Korea called last week, for instance, and said, can you lift the missile payload limits that you've put on us? Because we're feeling more and more scared about North Korea. And I have to say yes to them, because, things are getting bad for them. How could I say no? So if you don't want these sort of developments, then you should work with us quickly to solve this North Korea problem. And I would add finally that in order to get anywhere, I think one fear of China that has to get addressed is its fear of a unified pro-US Korean Peninsula. I think there needs to be some sort of grand bargain struck between the United States, China, of course, along with South Korea and other key players on what a future framework would look like on the Korean Peninsula that everyone could accept. And once that's in place, then it could serve as the foundation for more diplomatic coordination on North Korea.
Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Smythe, formerly of Lockheed Martin in Sunnyvale and Northrop Grumman here in Redondo Beach. There hasn't been a lot of discussion about the military might between China and the United States, so perhaps one of you would like to answer. We're bombing, I think, in about 5 countries, 6, 7 countries right now. Obviously, we have military actions there. How does China view that? I appreciate the comments about China's own interactions with Tibet and other places they've gone to, but right now, how does China see our actions, military actions in other countries?
All right, Xinbo, you are China.
Well, the U.S. has just increased its military presence in Afghanistan so as to help stabilize the situation. So, and also is fighting IS in the Middle East with the special troops. So basically, I think since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been very cautious in launching large-scale overseas military operation and has tried to limit the scope of its military operation in the Middle East and scaled down its presence in Afghanistan. Even though recently Trump decided to reverse the policy in Afghanistan by sending more troops. In the long term, I don't think the situation in Afghanistan can be stabilized only through military solution. There has to be a combination of military and political approaches. And in this regard, I guess the political approach is not adequate in helping stabilize the situation in Afghanistan. Now, I want to get back to the North Korea issue. 6 months from now, I guess North Korea will have more provocations by testing nuclear missile or both. That will only lead to more China-U.S. cooperation on this issue. Trump will learn gradually, understanding the complexity of the issue, no easy solution, but better U.S.-China coordination and cooperation can help manage the situation. So he wouldn't look for the short-term gain and easy solution. On the trade issue, I would say, I hope he will become more realistic and come back to the right track in negotiating with China for some long-term solution to this issue. So 6 months from now, I don't think there will be much change in this relationship. Especially, I hope when he comes to China in November, I guess his time in Beijing will be very short. But I think it's still very important that for him to sit down with President Xi to have some substantive discussion about bilateral relations and other issues. I think it's more and more important for him to develop a strategic vision, a big picture of this relationship.
So Kim Jong-un might be the Martian who brings us together. Is that what you're saying?
I cannot speak for him.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. Very quickly, what will China do when there are American tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea and Japan is welcoming in American nuclear weapons? Because that might be the next result. The response won't be the denuclearization, but the full-on nuclearization of the region. How can China then respond?
Sounds like a question for the founder of the Kennedy School.
I think I have a slightly different view on the North Korean issue, but specifically to this, there were tactical nuclear weapons in Korea earlier, and China didn't like it, but they didn't do anything about it. There were tactical nuclear weapons in Japan At least if you read the newspapers, they said that. And China didn't like it, but they didn't do anything about that. So I think basically what we have is people just sort of stumbling along, letting things happen, because the alternative seems even worse. And I think to your question earlier about the 6 months, I believe the most likely outcome is that having huffed and puffed, Trump will do the same thing Obama did, which was the same thing that Bush did, which was the same thing that Clinton did, which is not attack North Korea, and North Korea will then have a nuclear capability to hit Los Angeles with a nuclear weapon, even in 6 months. So I think that's the most likely. But I think it's also possible that Kim Jong-un could drag the US and China into a war, because Trump has said over and over, and I think he believes in his gut, it's totally unacceptable for Kim Jong-un to be able to threaten the American homeland with nuclear weapons. And I think actually most people, ordinary people, would say, yeah, he shouldn't be allowed to do that if there were some way to prevent him from doing it. Unfortunately, the only likely way to prevent him from doing it, given where we are now, is to strike the launch pads from which ICBM tests will occur, which we can easily do. Actually, that was the point at the Chocolate Cake Mar-a-Lago Summit. Trump explained to Xi, you're going to solve this problem, because you can, but if you don't solve the problem, he said, I'm going to solve this problem, and you're not going to like it. He served them chocolate cake. He said, excuse me, I have to go to the room next door. He announced that we were launching 50 cruise missiles against Syria, just to help him see how could we do this. The question is then, what does North Korea do in response? And we should remember in 1950, there was a war. And it was a war between the US and China. And most of the 50,000 Americans who died in that war were killed by Chinese. And most of several 100,000 Chinese who died in the war were killed by Americans. So if there were a war in the Korean Peninsula, it would be a real war.
Actually, I saw one of our less enlightened congressmen on TV saying, well, if we actually have that kind of a war, people are dying over there and they're not dying here. You know,
And that's Lindsey Graham. You can Google it. It's just you think, whoa.
all right, next question. I don't want to get into that one.
Hi, Meredith Shaw, USC. You made it clear earlier that you don't think that America is interested enough to come into a direct confrontation with China over the expansion in the South China Sea, because it's not part of our core national interests. But it is part of the core national interests of some of our key allies in the region. So my question is, hypothetically, what do you envision the U.S. would do if China were to move on some island territory of the Philippines or Japan, and it came down to a choice between defending our ally that we have a treaty obligation to, or getting into a direct, avoiding a direct confrontation with China? Which do you think the U.S. would choose?
I would say that the cases are each different because the treaty obligations are different. And I think in the Washington's conception of the relationship with Japan is it's vital. And the U.S. has said to China repeatedly that that includes the Senkakus, even though we don't take ultimately a position on who owns it. For the time being, they're administered by Japan. So if you were to seize them and Japan goes to war with you, we're going to back Japan. That's what we've told them repeatedly. Whether we would actually do that, I think, is a question in everybody's mind, but I think it would be likely. In the Philippines case, I think it would be a different story. And in the case of Vietnam, we don't have any treaty alliance with Vietnam. All they did was beat us in a war. Yeah.
Let me ask, because you know the U.S. and China share the same interests. I mean, China's going to have a blue water navy, like America. They're going to have bases around the world, and we share the interests of freedom of navigation and protecting our citizens and our assets overseas. I mean, we share that commonality. Is there a way in the South China Sea to start that process? I mean, Hugh White says just cave in, you know, and other, I'm not sure if that's the answer, but is there a way to start the process in the South China Sea by giving a little bit? Because China's been so aggressive in the South China Sea, which kind of is very different from past behaviors.
My sense of it, and John's been looking at this very closely, I think China looks at the South China Sea, and actually in my book, I have a little thing called China Seas, China Seas. So this PLA Navy guy, a friend of mine, he says, look at your own map. What's the name of this? It's called South China Sea. It's not called American Sea. The other one, East China Sea. So in the same way that Americans look out at the Caribbean and think, what the hell are foreigners doing there? And actually, if it seems very strange, look and see what we did in the 20th century when there's a communist outpost in Cuba. First, we tried to invade them, then we tried to assassinate the leader. So then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we don't adjust very well to other people right on our borders either. So I think that's what the Chinese are looking and seeing. As to the freedom of navigation, as I say, that's a core interest for the U.S., but it's even more importantly an interest for China. Every day, oil comes to China in ships. Those ships go a long blue water stretch. Who owns that stretch? We do, the U.S. Navy. So anything China can do anywhere close to its border, we've got another 5,000 miles where we can do the same thing. So I've proposed that we let them write the rules, whatever rules they would like, that they're prepared to play by. And we'll play by the same rules. So I think we could get an agreement with respect to that.
I think the U.S., the real concern of the U.S. is not so much about the freedom of navigation, but rather about the Chinese dominance in this region for geopolitical reasons. So you use the freedom of navigation as an excuse to get involved in the waters. But frankly speaking, China cares about freedom of navigation more than the U.S. does because we rely so heavily on this water for transportation. I think in the long run, as it's happening now, this is up to the China and the related countries to work out some kind of solution to this issue. So the ongoing negotiation over code of conduct in South China Sea is the right step in the right direction. And as time goes on, maybe we can sit down to negotiate about the disputes of specific islands and
All right,
IREFs.
John, quick comment from you. I see Terry McCarthy's here, so I'm getting scared. We're going to get really just thrown right out of here.
I'll run out. Just want to say one thing. I think to Professor Wu's point, I think the United States, since it began engaging with Asia, has been concerned that another power would rise up. Not to challenge us, but to dominate Asia. And I think that explains American policy in the South China Sea, in addition to the fact that the Navy likes to use freedom of navigation operations as an excuse to spy on China. So...
All right, well, on that happy note, and I think we can all decide that we're going to depend on the Martians to solve this problem. Thank you.